Growing up in a black household came with a lot of pressures, but there was no pressure like memorizing black movies. It kind of was like a rite of passage. I mean, there were movies like The Five Heartbeats, the Jackson 5 movie, Love and Basketball, The Wood, just to name a few. But there was arguably no movie more important to memorize than the movie Friday.
Craig.
Bye, Felicia.
Now, the movie Friday was monumental because it was written, directed, and produced by rapper Ice Cube. But what was more monumental was the memorable lines from the movie. I mean, you got the scene of Smokey standing over Devo screaming, "You got knocked the..." There's also the scenes like John Witherspoon on the toilet or School and Craig by the refrigerator. But one scene I'll never forget is when Craig walked in on his mom cooking breakfast and she's like, "I'm making
eggs, bacon, sausage, pancakes, and some leftover pork chops."
Later on in the movie, Craig sits down to the table and realizes there's not a plate for him. And his mom breaks the news to him like, "Yeah, I said I was cooking, but I didn't say I was cooking for you." Now that scene was funny. What wasn't funny was when I was a young man growing up in Brooklyn, realizing that the changes happening in my neighborhood were a lot like the changes happening in Craig's house. Yeah, there was some good stuff being cooked up, but it didn't mean it was for us. Yo, what's going on, guys? It's your boy Greg, back with another episode of All Black Everything. Before we get into today's video, I want to remind you to leave a like and a comment, and if you can, share this with your friends, man, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. Today we're going to be talking about a word that you may or may not have heard before, and that word is gentrification. Now, gentrification is defined as the buying and renovation of houses and stores in deteriorated urban neighborhoods by upper or middle income families or individuals, thus improving property values but often displacing low-income families and small businesses. That's it. That's the episode. No, I'm just playing. In order to better understand gentrification, what it looks like, and how it relates to black and brown families, we first have to take a trip back to the origins of suburbs. The development of suburbs was the answer to families who didn't want to live in the busy and sometimes overpopulated cities of the United States. A man named William Levitt created this idea in the early 1950s when he got back from World War II and realized that men who served in the war needed housing options for their families. This was good news, depending on the color of your skin. You see, Levitt's new model for housing took off in a major way in states like New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and New York. There was only one problem: redlining. In the mid-1900s, redlining was a discriminatory practice where banks and insurance companies refused or limited loans, mortgages, and insurance within specific geographic areas, especially in inner city neighborhoods. Simply put, redlining kept white neighborhoods white and black neighborhoods black. And so in the 1950s and 60s, white flight happened. And white flight was simply the mass exodus of white families from urban areas to the new suburban neighborhoods being constructed. Here's why that's important. As white people and their families left the inner cities of America, their tax dollars and resources went with them. And so US cities like Chicago, New York, and Los Angeles became heavily populated by black and brown families. Now, without the white families with their high salaries and tax contributions, those cities eventually transformed into underfunded ghettos that would eventually become subject to low-paying jobs, drug-infested streets, and subpar housing structures. The avoidance of inner city life lasted for decades in the 1900s. Even when enjoying things like sports events and nightlife, white families in America found refuge in their safer suburban neighborhoods. And then something shifted. The millennial generation made it very clear that they did not agree with their parents. Suburban 20-somethings decided en masse that living closer to their inner city jobs was more important than starting families and staying in the small towns where they grew up. And so the ghettos in major US cities began to see tons of renovation. It began with subtle improvements to their cemented streets and city infrastructures. And then it became less covert. Before we knew it, residential developments took the place of family businesses and homes. And sure, a lot of black and brown families sold their properties to interested developers, but many of them had no idea what was actually happening. Slowly but surely, residential developments and preferred accommodating businesses began to sprout in places that were once deemed unlivable or uncivil. Neighborhood parks that were once riddled with drug remnants and debris were now getting attention from city officials who turned a blind eye for years. I personally watched my childhood barbershop/bookstore transform into a set of high-rise buildings that no one I know can afford to live in. My trusty MTA train line began to get upgrades too, upgrades that suddenly became necessary now that the demographic was changing. One really big indication of change was the demolition of the Cascade factory that once stood between Marcy and Tompkins projects where I grew up. And when I say once stood, I mean like 10 years ago. Growing up, I passed this factory every day on my way, headed anywhere, be it school, work, or a friend's house. Locally, the Cascade was a commercial dry cleaning factory that cleaned the uniforms of major businesses and companies. It was important to the neighborhood because it employed so many of the parents of my friends in the neighborhood. And in 2010, just 3 years after I graduated high school, it was sold for $27 million and are being replaced right now by luxury apartments. And although the developers have been quoted saying that the developments will be all inclusive and that anyone who wanted to buy there could, the missed idea here is that not many black and brown families from the neighborhood can afford to live in those apartments. And I know life isn't about being fair, especially in America, but this is a prime example of what gentrification is. Gentrification says, hey, we're fixing up the neighborhood, and by the way, those new upgrades ain't for you. Another example of gentrification was the construction of the Barclays Center in downtown Brooklyn. Dubbed the new home to the Brooklyn Nets, the construction of the stadium was praised by developers, bragging that it would provide new jobs for black Brooklyn natives. But the construction of the stadium, as well as businesses and residential developments that would eventually surround it, wound up displacing more black families than the stadium actually would employ. Now, am I excited to see changes in the once dangerous and underfunded neighborhoods that I grew up in? Heck yeah. But that excitement is short-lived when I remember that those changes were not made with folks like me in mind. As the once less desirable neighborhoods in New York become more populated with whiter and richer individuals, it doesn't just hurt that those changes we've needed for so long is only happening because of their arrival. It hurts that in the times we live in, they can freely occupy our streets, but the warm welcome isn't extended when we occupy theirs. My name is Greg, and this has been another episode of All Black Everything. Peace.